We're basically standing in the middle of the ocean for wildlife. This paddock is like the ocean, and we have to find a way to actually bring those animals into the landscape across all of this oceany area. I wanted to focus today on how we can be really sustainable, what we can use on site to create really great outcomes for wildlife and for our plant communities as well. We can have a look at what regeneration looks like when we're not putting a whole heap of money into it, because we kind of think about restoration and regeneration as let's go and plant a tree, and we really can step beyond that and have a look at what the land can do in terms of how it can regenerate itself, and we just help that process along. Everything that we're doing isn't rocket science. All of it, once we kind of understand the tricks of what we're trying to achieve, should be pretty straightforward and easy. We know that we're losing hollows far, far quicker than we can replace them, and those resources for all of our tree hollow using animals just don't exist in the landscape anymore because we've lost them through natural processes, through fire, or we cut them down on purpose because we consider that they're dangerous. So thinking about retaining your hollows is always something that we should have our eye on whenever we're thinking about regeneration, because they'll add huge value back into our biodiversity. There's a whole heap of things that will only come and use your areas when tree hollows are present for them to breed or potentially even to feed for some of the species. So whenever you've got hollow bearing trees, regardless of small or large, you need to try to retain them. Dead stags are great too, and we're talking about 80 years for a hollow the size of a sugar glider to form, and a big hollow like owl-sized or glider-sized is 150 to 200 years depending on your tree species. So they're always something that we want to retain or to recreate. One of the first things that we need to do before we go anywhere on the property is to think about our potential to bring disease into the landscape, and that's becoming increasingly important when we see diseases like myrtle rust and Phytophthora really impacting our plant communities. So what I would like us to do first of all is to make sure that our boots are cleaned before we walk too far all over the property. When I look at this patch and go, how will this provide the most benefit to animals, the first thing I look at is the amount of vegetation covering the dam surface. That might be lovely if you're a rail and you want to get through some weedy stuff, but most birds actually can't use that water source even though it's there, because they can't access when it's that thick on top. If we'd had a bit more resources and time, we'd have been building a little bird drinking dam above this dam. I would think, if this was my dam, about removing some of that weedy cover, at least just in one corner of the dam, and then creating access points for the wildlife. One of the things that we want to do today is potentially to use some of the small sticks that we see to create some perching areas right at the edge where we do have a bit of free water that will provide access to some of those birds. I started just throwing sticks across the waterways, and it was amazing how quickly the honeyeaters would come down and go, yes, this is a dam that I can sometimes drink from, but its predators are going to get me when I go to the edge of the dam. So if you can think about what those birds want to access. Think about the diameter of the perching areas for the birds to get on and be able to access the water. Suddenly it changes the accessibility, and within 30 seconds of putting sticks down, families of honeyeaters were down drinking on the dam off these little sticks. When I think about how I'm going to do a planting for building corridors, it's like what provides access for. First, it's going to be things like birds, because they'll hopscotch across the landscape. Potentially small mammals. There'll be frogs that get in there if we have a water source. Reptiles are a huge part of it, and I think we really underestimate because we just don't pay attention to them, or people don't like reptiles. But reptiles are integral to building that really diverse biodiversity, because things love to eat them, and they love to eat things, and all of that's a really important part of the food web. So encouraging those small reptiles that are our ground fauna is a really great thing to be able to do. When we think about what gives the best benefit to biodiversity, it's not just about canopy trees, it's not just about understory, but it's about that level of complexity that goes all the way from the top to the bottom. You can hear some little foliage birds pipping away at the top of this canopy. They wouldn't be here if we didn't have that level of complexity. So for every 1 metre that we see up a tree trunk, that's generally a different species of bird coming in here to forage and use that layer. And that's what builds those really diverse communities, is when we build that complexity. Sometimes we can't wait for those trees to get really big to build that sort of complexity, and then for a mid-story to grow in between it. Sometimes we have to create that. And you can do it really easily by pruning, managing your trees to keep them lower and bushy. And really, I think when we do a lot of regeneration, one of the elements that we miss is that really complex mid-story that's going to bring all of that benefit to the patch that we're trying to recreate. So today, when we do our small garden, we really want to focus on bringing the shrubbery. Bring the shrubbery. We should write it on a shirt. Bring the shrubbery, because that's what's really going to bring the biodiversity as we move through. A lot of wildlife are very scared about crossing that space from the trees over there to where we are. Small birds won't do it. It's just too far and too dangerous for them. Usually that flight distance would be no more than about 30 metres for some of our really small species to even think about coming in to use whatever that resource is that we're putting there. So what we want to do is create, even if it's just 2 lines of connectivity to that forest, that's going to allow our small scared species to sort of pop and hopscotch through the vegetation and get to our bigger planting that's over here. And we want to have that sort of alleyway leading down to the dam, at least on one side, but to have those sentinel trees further back, because birds, when they can move through that alleyway, will generally get up, sit up here and go, now I can stay and look for danger, and when I see that it's all okay, then I can go down and have a drink. And the other thing to think about too is encouraging pollinators always when you're doing your planting, and I think that's a part of that low shrub layer that we really don't pay attention to a lot of the time. But anything that's providing good pollen, or if we can put some melaleucas that are going to load up somewhere, I would always include those. They'll be great for the nectivorous birds, but they'll make such an insect diversity that everything else can feed on as well. Generally the LLS would say you'd need to stay 20 metres away from the dam wall, so we just need to be mindful of what species we choose, so we don't want to compromise the structure of the dam at all. But we can definitely go for shrubbery. Always the good thing is to find some shrubbery and get that going.
People say that you shouldn't put the shrubs and things too close to the water because you've got to have the flight path coming in.
You do.
Distance that...
Well, it depends what it is. When I'm planting like flaky bark melaleuca, which I know won't hurt the dam, I generally just leave access ways, and I will generally plant that shrubbery down the bottom, and then I would have a sentinel tree. I think of it as a sentinel tree that sits beside or behind the planting, away from the dam, where it's not going to affect the structure. Yeah. We don't realise how important the amenity, that the equipment that we put around our trees is for wildlife. I've seen brown antechinus move through a paddock 3 days after matting has gone down, just hopscotching plant guard to plant guard to plant guard to get right across the paddock, which was amazing to see. We want birds to perch, so we want to encourage birds first because they'll poo, they'll bring seed from the forest, they'll do all of that good stuff. So everything that we can give birds to perch on, we want to do. I've seen 5 or 6 species now get down on tree guards within half an hour of them being up, and I thought, oh, you're just having a sit on the tree guard, you know, it's a nice place to perch. But I actually watched them for a while, and they were using them as sallying points to go down and forage down into the rest of the patch. So the tree guards themselves are important, and I would say people love to hate on corflute tree guards, the hard plastic tree guards. When you have a water element, those corflute guards are amazing. You can use them 2 or 3 times sometimes and change them between plants, but frogs find them a fantastic place to go and retreat. So when you've got a dam, I would always use corflute near the edge of the dam because you're providing habitat for those frogs while your trees get up and grow.
Where's that pot?
We have this idea that it should happen like that, but this is a slow game, you know? So put in some fast-growing things that you'll be able to look at and go, yes, you're growing. But just remember to be patient with it all. You know, eventually these guys were talking about joining up to, you know, the bushland at the top, going along and planting this wet gully, the soak line up to the line of trees that are on that paddock border, and then potentially beyond there. And it's just thinking about where you can connect one bit of veg to the next on your property. And as I said, it doesn't always have to be with trees. Sometimes you can think about the amenity of the other things that you have there. We're here building habitat poles to make retreat sites for wildlife in a microcorridor. It's really important that you chink up the holes to make sure that you're not creating a haven for predators. what you want as a haven for the wildlife you're trying to encourage. So these things are going to be awesome for small mammals, for our reptile fauna, and also for small birds and frogs as well. It's fantastic to have these inclusions of the perch poles because they will allow the birds to start coming and sitting, using the resource of the dam that's beside there and dropping seed, which will help boost our regeneration. And it's really great to just create islands inside the ocean of the paddock to allow the fauna to move through. And so all of this is, pretty standard stuff, but you want to be really careful about the way you create density inside the pile. So at the moment they're really too open to be useful for most species. We want that to be as densely packed as we can, and we'll have some small timbers that we're going to thread in amongst the rest of the pile form to chink up the gaps, because that's going to create little retreat huts which will be great for our reptiles and small mammals. Generally, I would say when we build them out of timber, they're better than when they're built out of stone, just because the timber is degrading, it's throwing nutrients back into the soil, it's creating microsites for plant seeds to regenerate, it keeps water in the landscape. People have this idea of clearing up and burning off timber piles as a big part of it, but I would always encourage people to retain those, and that's where we're seeing all of our beginnings of our ground fauna diversity start to develop inside these. If I didn't have wood, I would be laying sheets of corrugated iron. There's old sheds down here on the back of the property. I'd be laying cover boards down as a part of what I would create in my corridor to get over to this habitat pile and then potentially further up the hill too. And those things are fantastic for reptiles and usually take about 6 months to settle in, and then can provide homes for a long time for all of those scaly guys, and for frogs too, and a heap of insects of course that we want to bring in.
We're just filling up these holes that are potential sites where cats can get in to get the reptiles and things.
Perfect for basking lizards. Blue-tongue lizards will be basking on this log in that warmth. We're cutting pieces of timber just to plug the holes in this mound over here. Some of these bigger ones will be perches, but the smaller ones, the round logs, will fill up all the holes and hopefully stop the predators from being in there. We don't want feral cats taking up and making that their home as well. Everything else is going to live in here, and we don't need feral cats. Ryan from Shoalhaven Landcare. So I run the fox control program across 94 private land holdings in the Shoalhaven, and it's around 17,000 hectares that we operate on. Today we're doing all this beautiful tree planting and restoring this habitat around this dam, but I just made the point that this is feral cat habitat as well, so we have to contend with trying to bring native wildlife back like bandicoots, and the feral cats are here waiting, so this would be an ideal spot to set a cage trap, again needing to be checked every day. We can build all these things and bring the wildlife, but we do need to remove foxes and cats from the environment. Generally a cat or fox would be here at night eating frogs out of this drainage line and into this dam, so they're already here at night. We intend on bringing more wildlife, so we need to protect them.
In the car today I have some old clay piping. I got it off Facebook Marketplace for free. We will use those specifically for retreat sites for frogs. They're going to be the things that will heat up. Chytridiomycosis is a disease that's sweeping through all of our frog populations and decimating them. When we walk through a water body, we take chytrid on our shoes, same thing. We really need to be careful about how we walk through water or ride push bikes through water or whatever that is. One of the things that we know can defeat chytrid is heat. So in our habitat hubs today, we'll be building some what we would call frog saunas, and that's places for frogs to actually get in there, heat their bodies up, and that will allow them to shed chytrid. Naturally, frogs, particularly tree frogs, would do this by climbing up into tree hollows and overwintering, and then they would shed all of that diseased skin, and then they would dry out enough that they wouldn't have the chytrid, and usually when they come back down to the water to breed again, they get reinfected. We're going to put them on the edges of the piles to make sure that they're catching sun. So have a look, we really want them to be on the western side of the pile so they get really hot, and that will give opportunities for frogs that are being exposed to chytrid to actually get in there, heat themselves up safely, and hopefully shed that chytrid disease so that they're healthy. What I would do is potentially grab some bits of this barky stuff, lay that over one side, so you've got a cool side and a hot side, and they'll be able to choose which is the good side. You might find also living frogs that already are impacted by disease that haven't yet died, and they tend to sit out in the sun where you don't expect a frog to be, so they're often really visible in the daytime in odd places where they're getting a lot of heat. When we look at a planting, often we look at it with the eyes of it's untidy, and that untidiness is absolutely the complexity that we're aiming for when we want to bring wildlife into the landscape. I know that we're looking at whiskey grass and it's a bad thing and people hate it, but really this grassy element of what happens in between the plants, provided it's not strangling your plants, is incredibly important for wildlife. We have emu wrens that used to be on this property, and they may still be here, if we're lucky. So grassy elements particularly, there's a whole decline in our bird fauna and the small grass-using birds and the small folivorous birds. They're just disappearing out of rural landscapes and out of urban ones because we keep taking away the bits of habitat that are so important. As I said, they're stuck in that layer of habitat that they need to use, and it's not one that we promote, and long grasses are a big part of that. So don't look at your planting and go, it's untidy, I've got a slash between my plants. Provided you've got enough space for your plant itself to grow and it's not being impacted, you want to leave those grasses there and really to encourage them.
The number of finches that we get and little birds actually hopping around the grass, which hasn't been mowed now for 3 months, and it's not particularly high, it's no higher than this here, but they just love hopping around and just pecking the seeds and stuff like that. So the neighbours that mow their grass every 2 weeks right through winter are just not seeing that.
We're starting to realise all of the benefits that this beautiful complexity behind us brings, not just to what we want to see in terms of biodiversity, but also in benefits for stock health. It's amazing to see that shift being really embraced.